Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar about Amendment 4 and how it will affect cities. We will answer your questions at the end, so please hold your questions for that time. Use the Q&A section on your screen to submit your questions at the end, or you may submit them to the webinar speakers via their contact information at a later time. Today's presentation will be posted in the FLC website at www.floridaleagueofcities.com under the Events and Training tab as soon as possible following the session. Today's facilitators are Amber Hughes. Amber is a legislative advocate for the League, and she handles finance, taxation, and personnel issues. John Thomas will also be facilitating this webinar, and he is the Director of Communications and Political Initiatives for the League.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is Amber Hughes, and I want to thank you all for joining us today. I wanted to start off a little bit and tell you how we got to where we are today and talking about Amendment 4. Back in the 2011 session, there was a House Joint Resolution that was sponsored. It was committee substitute by committee substitute for committee substitute for committee substitute for committee substitute for House Joint Resolution 381. My fun fact of the day is that that is the most committee substitutes that any joint resolution has ever had that has passed both houses. Obviously, this joint resolution did pass. It passed the House by 105 affirmative votes in May, and it was sponsored by Representative Dorworth. In the Senate, it was sponsored by Senator Fasano and passed by 25 yeas. The interesting thing about this is because there are multiple ways to amend the Constitution, you can obviously have a ballot initiative that is brought forward by the voters, or you can have proposed constitutional amendments that come out of the Taxation Budget Reform Commission or the Constitutional Convention. When it's a joint resolution that comes forward through the legislature, it requires a 3/5 vote of the legislature. That's 60%. So in the Senate, the joint resolution actually only passed by 2 votes. That was the good news that day. Unfortunately, it did pass. But this is kind of how we got to this point. It was the joint resolution passed both chambers and therefore went to the Secretary of State for what will happen next. Next slide, please. First of all, just a little basic Constitutional Amendment 101. The 2012 ballot that the voters will see in November is actually going to be probably one of the most lengthy we've ever had in Florida's history. There are 11 different constitutional amendments on that ballot. There will be the numbers up to 12, but one has been removed. This amendment will, of course, be Amendment 4. It will require 60% of voter approval, but the reason that I point out that there are so many amendments on there and that it will be such a long ballot is that this amendment alone has a ballot summary of over 700 words, and it is in very detailed, what I would call legalese. And so I think that the reason I think it's important that you all have joined us today is that even just reading the ballot summary, it doesn't necessarily explain in a user-friendly manner what this amendment does. And we'll get to the specifics of that, but it does require 60% of voter approval on November 6th in order for it to become effective. And just generally, there are 3 components to this amendment, and we're going to go into more depth of those in a minute, but the majority of these components will be effective upon passage. So if it gets 60% voter approval in November, every single component will be effective immediately, and then the first-time homesteader exemption will actually be retroactive. So it will apply to any purchase that was made as of January 1st, 2012. The reason I point that out, that means that everyone that has bought a house in Florida that would meet the criteria of the first-time homesteader exemption will be able to take advantage of this. And so we have 10 months worth of property sales that could potentially take advantage of this new exemption. Next slide, please. So this is the summary sheet of what the 3 main components of this proposed constitutional amendment are. And I will go into more detail, but I just wanted to have it in one place so that you all can see how varied even the issues in this amendment are. Yes, they do all deal with property tax or ad valorem taxes, but they are on all forms of the spectrum when it comes to property tax. So you have the Non-Homestead Assessment Cap, the first-time homesteader exemption, and then what we call anti-recapture. And I will go into more detail right now. So next slide, please, Jenna. So probably the most problematic component of the Amendment 4, in my perspective is the Non-Homestead Assessment Cap. And what that does is it reduces the annual growth and assessment limitations, or assessment cap as I like to call it, on almost all non-homesteaded properties from 10% to 5%. If you recall, when Amendment 1 passed a few years ago, that was the first time that Floridians had seen an assessment cap on non-homesteaded properties. And when we refer to non-homestead, we mean everything that is not a homesteaded residence. So that includes vacant land, commercial, industrial, second home, multifamily, every property that is not a tax roll, that is not, or the majority of properties that are on tax rolls that are not homesteaded properties. So when we saw this in, back when Amendment 1 passed, historically we had heard about, people's taxes going up 50% because they were experiencing the huge growth or the huge boom that we did experience back in 2005 through 2007. That 10% cap has been in place for quite a few years now, but I think it's important to point out that the only properties that have truly benefited from the 10% cap were vacant lands. When the Amendment 1 was passed, it also put in a sunset provision saying that the 10% cap would go away in January 1st, 2019. Amendment 4 will actually extend the assessment limitation until 2023. So not only will it reduce it down to 5%, it will extend it out another 4 years. So you might ask, well, why is this a big deal? And I want you to think about the history of Florida, the Florida tax system here. In 1992, when Floridians passed Save Our Homes, I think it was a very noble tax policy. The concept was we do not want to tax long-term Florida residents out of their houses. And so we determined that it was important, if you were a homesteaded property owner, meaning that that was your primary residence, that you had some sort of protection in how fast your assessment could grow, or your assessment being what the rate is charged against in order to get the taxes that you owe. So we put a 3% assessment limitation on all non-homesteaded properties. And that was the policy and the direction that the citizens of Florida decided they want to go. If you recall, also with Amendment 1, there unintended consequences occurred. As property values or market values grew, there became huge disparities in how much identical property owners would have to pay in taxes. I mean, I think I've heard the saying, the best day in Save Our Homes, or the worst day in Save Our Homes is the first day you're in it. The longer you're in it, the greater what we call your Save Our Home differential, or the difference between your assessment cap and your market, or your assessment and your market value change. So as you're in Save Our Homes, obviously you get the huge benefit, but then we had what we call the lock-in effect, where it was not feasible for a lot of Floridians to sell their property and either move into a larger house or even a smaller house because they were going to lose that Save Our Home differential. So in Amendment 1 passed, they include portability in that. Well, when you look at Amendment 4, with it further reducing down the assessment limitation, it does not include portability. So when you think about taking those same type of flawed tax policies and putting them onto the rest of the tax rolls, including our businesses, I think that there is a huge concern that we're going to have unintended consequences, whether it's competitiveness issues with businesses or hurting our new or expanding businesses. The idea that you can have, the baker that's been there for 10 years, and then in 5 years another baker comes in right across the street in an identical property and is automatically going to have higher taxes, I don't think that is necessarily the message that we want to send to businesses both in our state and ones that want to move here. I also think it's important to point out that it's not just new businesses but also expanding businesses this could impact. When you look at the fact that you could have Joe Citizen that makes widgets that all of a sudden decides that he needs to add 30 employees and would need to move to a new facility, he would not be allowed to take that differential with him, and therefore it might not be feasible for him financially to move to a larger location. I think that the whole concept of having inequities in property owners, and this is something that I think is, I know this is talked about a lot in Tallahassee and actually throughout the state, as I hear from a lot of you guys, our members, is that we have a very complicated tax system. We have chosen winners and losers. It is definitely not an equitable system, but this definitely just exacerbates the inequity of especially identical property owners. And so I think that is very important to point out. That one other point I want to make on this, and this actually will apply to both this and the first-time homesteader exemption, is that these reforms only apply to non-school ad valorem. So when you look at who the taxing entities are, you obviously have cities or municipalities, counties, special districts, and then schools. When you have what property tax reform that only impact the non-school ad valorem, that once again exacerbates a complicated system and exacerbates the lack of fairness. And so I just want to make sure that that's pointed out. If this was such good tax policy, I would say what's good for the goose is good for the gander, and that was not the direction that the legislature chose to go with the majority of the components in Amendment 4. Next slide, please. So the second component of Amendment 4 is what is called the first-time homesteader exemption, and I'm going to use those words lightly. First-time homesteader is defined as an individual who has not received homestead exemption in the past 3 years in Florida. So that is a lot larger than someone who is actually a larger pool of applicants than someone who has just never homesteaded within Florida. This could be the snowbirds that have lived here, been wintering here for 20 years and now decide that they're going to spend 6 months in one day in order to take advantage of this exemption. And what the exemption is, it is an additional homestead exemption that is equal to 50% of the just value of a property up to the median just value for the county. You'll get the 100% of the exemption in the first year, and then it will reduce by 20% every year to where it phases out over a 5-year period. As this happens, obviously the Save Our Homes assessment limitation will be rising up, and so the property owner will also get the benefit of that, and you'll also be getting the homestead exemptions as well. And I know this is kind of complicated, so I have a couple of examples I'm going to lead you through. I was in Miami this morning, so the Miami County median home value is $140,000. So if I moved to Miami and I'm a first-time homesteader, meaning I had not homesteaded within 3 years, and I buy a $200,000 house, in that first year I will get an additional exemption that is equal to $100,000 because that is below 50% of the it is below the median home value. The next year, that additional exemption will be reduced down to $80,000 and so on and so forth. If I go and buy a $300,000 home, the first year exemption would not be $150,000. It would only be $140,000 because that is the just value for the county. But once again, it would reduce by 20% every year until it goes away. I just want to point out again that this will apply, if Amendment 4 passes, this will apply to all properties that were purchased as of January 1st, 2012 and will be applicable to the 2013 tax rolls. I think that it's important to realize that the pool of applicants for this is much larger than the new family that just moves to Florida with their and wants to start a life here. There are definitely going to be people who have either been renters or the snowbirds that I discussed, or maybe people who unfortunately had to deal with foreclosures that could still take advantage of this additional exemption. Next slide, please, Jenna. So the third component of Amendment 4 is what I like to call anti-recapture, and I want to go back to Save Our Homes that passed in 1992 real quick. If you recall, the whole concept behind Save Our Homes was predictability and stability in your property taxes. So therefore, we have the 3% assessment limitation, meaning that a property owner's assessment cannot go up more than 3%. But if for some reason they had down market turns and their just value went down, it would still, their assessment would still increase by 3% or CPI. Of course, historically back in 1992, I don't think anyone ever really thought through the fact that property values would go down. I know growing up it was all, invest in real estate, it only goes up. Well, in Florida we realized that that's not necessarily true, and when we had the Great Recession we did have properties who obviously market values dropped over 20% statewide. I think that that was the first time that anyone really understood what that recapture rule truly meant. That being said, it's important to recognize that even though municipalities have lost 20% of their property value collections over the past 5 or 6 years, that is still with their ability to recapture some of that Save Our Homes differential. And it's also important to point out that the property owners, their assessed value never actually grew more than their market value or their just value. So all the recapture does is it just kind of recaptures a small portion of that Save Our Home differential every single year that the market values are decreased. This is the one component of this proposal that actually could have a school impact. Obviously, this will require the legislature to go in and modify by general law, so the earliest they could do this would be in the 2013 session that's coming up in March. But knowing that there is a school impact, I would think that the legislature would have to appropriate funds to kind of cover those shortfalls of the recapture impacts on our school tax levies. Next slide, please. So this is where we get into the numbers. Obviously, this is just the estimated taxable value impact. Most people that deal really closely with taxes like to do taxable value because it's a little more accurate, because you don't have to make millage assumptions. But this is the reduction in taxable value that will happen in each fiscal year that this is effective, and then broken down. And so obviously, 2013, 14, 15, 16, you know the numbers. But the first-time homesteader exemption, you can see that there. The 5% non-homesteaded cap is the next column over. The anti-recapture is actually broken up into two components. One is the anti-recapture on homesteaded properties, and the other is the anti-recapture on non-homesteaded properties. And then if you see the grand total over 4 years is the $63 billion removal of taxable value that we would see just from this one amendment. Obviously, once again, I want to point out that the recapture provisions will require additional legislation to implement, but the other two are self-implementing. Next slide, please. And this is the one that you have to make the assumption, and whenever we do statewide tax impacts, we always assume a non-school ad valorem millage of 10.2. So obviously, if you are in an area where you have higher millage, then the impacts would be higher. If you're in an area with lower millage, it would be lower. And so if you look, and the reason that we talk about this in a 4-year total is because you have to understand that these impacts are not in a time where we're having normal growth rates. We're not anticipated to have normal growth rates for a couple more years, normal growth rates being like 3 or 4%, not normal growth rates being what we had in 2005 and 2006. But you'll see that a $1.7 billion impact just to non-school ad valorem, and the expectation is from the economists is that as we get further out and return to more normal growth patterns, that those impacts will grow increasingly faster, given that you are once again, one of the issues with the non-homestead assessment cap is that you are taking a depressed real estate market and setting the cap or the limitation when it's at the bottom. So it doesn't give local governments the ability to take advantage of those growth factors as we have historically. So if the growth is, over, anything over, you have to say a combination of the 3% cap for Save Our Homes and the 5% cap for non-homestead, anything over that, and there's no ability to take advantage of it. I think it's important to realize that that is historically how we've managed to keep up with the increased cost in just increased cost of doing business. Obviously, we currently are at we're below 2004 property tax collections, but we still have population levels that are 2012, and we still have costs of providing services that are 2012. We're not anticipated to even get back to those 2004 property tax levels until 2014. And so I think that when you look at the history of property taxes going back to the 70s, which is the charts I have that go back the farthest, we have historically been able to keep on a trend line that was population and personal income growth. We did veer a little bit off that trend, obviously, during the economic boom, but I would say that the market recorrected itself, and we are now drastically below our historical trend line for property taxes in this state. The one other thing that I want to point out is, and I think this is a good way because it has all of the three different components is that each one of these components is picking a winner and a loser. And obviously, the proponents of the amendment say that they are shifting the tax burden. They even say they're shifting the tax burden back to the homesteaded property owners. But I think that that's something that the voters need to understand, that each one of these components, there will be a shift in tax liability because taxes are a zero-sum game. So if you are a traditional homesteaded property owner, while you might get some advantage from the recapture provision, the other two components of the amendment are going to shift additional tax burden to, or additional tax liability to you. So even if municipalities choose not to raise millage, they most likely will have to cut services. And so I think that's important to realize, that with each one of these components, you're picking a winner and a loser, and you're shifting tax burden, and they don't all line up to the way you think. They don't all benefit one entity of properties. Once again, this I think it's important to point out that for the most part, most of these do not impact school ad valorem. Once again, they levy about 49% of ad valorem, and they are only impacted by this from the recapture, which of course will require additional legislative implementation. And next slide, please. And here is the breakdown of the tax impact, and this is based off of the statewide number, so once again based off the 10.9 mils, but this is the breakdown between cities, counties, and special districts. If you look at the first 4 years, obviously counties are down another $1 billion. Counties are down, I think, $2 billion over the last 5 years, and so that's an additional $1 billion over the next 4. If you look at cities, they're down almost $500,000. Cities are down $750,000 over the last 5 years, and cities at this point only levy $3.3 billion worth of taxes. So I think that it's important to look at the whole picture. When you have almost $25 billion worth of property taxes levied, cities levy one of the smallest portions besides independent districts. They levy $3.3 billion. So, and then of course you have the independent or special districts who have an impact that's a little over $200 million. So we're looking at, once again, the total non-school tax impact in the 4-year aggregate of $1.7 billion. The one thing I do want to point out here, since these are statewide average numbers, is that if you live in an area that has a higher percentage of non-homesteaded property, you will be disproportionately impacted. Obviously, the statewide average for municipalities is about 37% are homesteaded, or 37% are homesteaded. So if you have a greater number, so if you're in a tourist area and you have a lot of hotels, or if you are in a city that has a lot of industrial or vacant lands, I mean, you are going to be disproportionately impacted by Amendment 4 as opposed to the average city that meets the the statewide averages for the percentage of homesteaded properties on the tax rolls. And next slide, please. And I know that this has been really quick. I've been going around the state doing this, so I think I have it down to a science. But I just want to leave you with the fact that this is, this is a very complicated amendment, and I think that given the fact, I keep going back to the 700-word summary, I would invite you all to go look it up. I know it's out there, and to see if just by reading it, if you can understand it. And I think that just shows the importance of making sure that we're educated about what it really does. And with that, I guess we're going to open it up to questions.
Great. Thank you, Amber. Yes, and now we will take your questions. Feel free to use the Q&A section on your screen to submit questions, and John Thomas and Amber Hughes will be glad to tackle them together. I'll just remind you, as we're waiting for the first few questions to trickle in here, that today's presentation will be posted on the FLC website. It will be under the Events and Training tab. And if you have questions that you aren't comfortable asking in the webinar forum, feel free to use the contact information on the screen to submit them anytime.
Maybe I was too thorough.
Oh, we just had a couple come in.
Okay.
Okay, the first question is, where can I reference for when I explain it to others that it is said that the tax burden will be shifted to homeowners?
Where can you reference? I'll have to think about that. I would say that most people realize that property taxes or any taxes are a zero-sum game. I like to use the analogy of the balloon. If you push in the balloon one place, it will shoot out the other side. And that doesn't necessarily mean, when I say tax liability, it doesn't necessarily mean that their taxes will go up. It also can mean that their percentage of liability or that they get for those services could also go up. So if you have a city that determines if Amendment 4 passes, they determine not to raise taxes or raise millage, but instead to lower services, that homesteaded property owner would still pay a greater portion for less services. So if they started out getting paying $10 worth of taxes and getting 50% worth of services, and services are cut in half, I'm just using easy numbers here, they would still pay $10 worth of services, but only for 25% of those services. So I think that there's not one site. I'll have to look to see if it was in the Tax Watch report, but it's more basic tax policy or conceptual tax policy that says if you go in and you either raise millage, obviously that's an easy one to understand, but if you reduce services, that their tax burden for those services, their taxes would be the same, but the services would be less. Therefore, they have a higher tax liability.
Okay, the next question, can you please explain the anti-recapture once again?
Of course. So currently, if you're homesteaded property owners and you have the advantage of the Save Our Home assessment limitation or assessment cap, which says that your property value or your assessed value can only go up 3% every year. It also says that you have what we call your just value, which is equal to your market value, and then you also have your assessed value, which is the number that the tax collectors use to multiply times the millage to get your tax bill. So what the Save Our Homes recapture says is that as your market value grows and your assessment value only grows by 3%, you get this huge differential. We call it our Save Our Homes differential. So it's the difference between your just value and your market value. Well, if you have an economic event like we've had the last few years where your just value or your market value actually decreases, your assessed value would still grow slightly by either CPI or 3%, depending on which one gets factored in. So what recapture does is it allows some of that differential to be recaptured every single year that we have a down market. Obviously, your assessed value can never go over your market value, but all it does is kind of recoup some of that disparity between the market value and the just value. What Amendment 4 says is that it would allow the legislature to go in and undo all of that, meaning that if your market value goes down, there's never a situation where any of that differential or that disparity would get recouped. And I know from a lot of the homesteaded property owners kind of got up, had never seen this before historically since Save Our Homes passed until we had the downturn in the market. But I do think it's important to point out that even though municipalities were down 20%, that was with recouping some of that Save Our Homes differential. And I also point out that another reason that our tax system is so complicated in the state is because there is no real connection between what your market value or your just value is and what your assessment value. We have completely bifurcated the two, and this is just another step towards even further down that path of having no correlation between your market value and assessment value.
Okay, the next question, how do you respond to the Amendment 4 proponents when they say this will help revitalize the troubled housing market?
I'd be happy to take that question. I would say that a couple of points on this. They They cite a TaxWatch report that was done in 2012 that does say that Amendment 4 would create so many jobs and create so many home purchases over the next 10 years. I would also say that that specific report does not factor in any sort of municipal cuts to local government services or increase to taxes. And I would also say that TaxWatch has two different reports, but one I'm going to talk about, which was put out in March 2012, and it's called When Good Policies Go Bad. And it talks about how, I'm going to quote it. It says, given Florida's historical reliance on the real estate development and transactional activity for economic development, the 5% cap would be the harbinger of Florida's economic demise. And so I think that you have to look at the unintended consequences. You know, yes, you know, the proponents say that it will sell so many new homes, but you're also not factoring in what kind of code enforcement has been done in those neighborhoods that have foreclosures. You know, I know that a lot of the cities are having to deal with those issues. You're not factoring into how nice are the sidewalks or how good are the services that all the cities offer. And those, of course, do go into having healthy and happy communities, which obviously facilitate more home sales. I just think that it's important to realize that the report that they cite doesn't necessarily give the full picture.
Thank you. The next question I can take, it's an easy one. Can this presentation be printed? Yes. Once it's uploaded onto the website, it will load just like a typical PowerPoint, and you can print it just like you would a PowerPoint. And if you have any trouble doing that, my contact information for a Jenna Titcomb is up on the screen, so just feel free to contact me and I'll walk you through it. The next question is, will this raise property taxes for homesteaded property owners?
I would go back to what we were talking about with tax liability. I would say when you actually talk about, would it raise property taxes, that's going to depend so much on the decisions that are made at the local level. So obviously if a municipality or a county determine that they've weathered 5 years of decreased taxes and they can no longer kick the can down the road, so to speak, they obviously have that ability to make that decision to raise millage, which is the only thing that could really raise your taxes. I would go back to the comment about tax liability. This is definitely a shift in tax liability from non-homesteaded property owners onto longtime Florida residents or homesteaded property owners.
Okay, the next question, can you review again the homestead versus non-homesteaded properties and impact? Do you mean by parcel numbers or values? Many cities are 70% residential and taxable value.
I think I misspoke when I said the 35. It's 35% non-homesteaded, so thanks for correcting me. And actually, you want me to just go back over them? Can you go back a couple slides, Jenna, to the taxable value? And it's based off of value, and when the REC, the Revenue Estimating Conference, did this, they did go down to the parcel level. They used the Department of Revenue's tax portal website. The Department of Revenue traditionally, when they do these types of impact conference, come with all the data, and then the three members of the REC, who include someone from the Senate, someone from the House, and someone from EDR, they come up with what they call a consensus estimate. And so, but they do it based off value, and you're completely right. It's like 37%. I think it's 37% are non-homesteaded, because I know that counties are a little more skewed of having more residential, obviously, than municipalities are.
Okay, great. As a follow-up to a question you answered earlier, Amber, they'd like to know, what is this TaxWatch study that you mentioned?
It is called, it's from March 2010, and it's called When Good Policies Go Bad, the Unintended Economic Consequences of Assessment Caps. And if anyone would like that, they can email me, and I'd be happy to send them out to them. My contact information is on the last page.
Great. Okay, the next question, who benefits more from the non-homesteaded cap reduction, second home buyers or businesses?
I would say they both benefit. It's going to depend on, the value of the parcel. It's parcel by parcel. You can choose who's going to really benefit more. But since it's a 5% cap on both of them, it's, they both benefit.
Okay, the next question. Can you explain how it will negatively impact schools again, please?
Of course. The only provision of Amendment 4 that could impact schools is the anti-recapture provision, and that will require additional action by the legislature. So the earliest if this amendment is to pass, the earliest the legislature can come in and implement the constitutional amendment would be in the 2013 session. And what it says, the anti-recapture, schools benefit from recapture just as other local governments do. They still they get that ability to recoup some of that differential just as we do. So if there is no longer the recapture, then they will no longer get that benefit, and that's where the school impact comes from.
Okay, the next question, if not Amendment 4, then what alternative would you like to see, if anything?
In my perfect world, we'd go back to the drawing board. I'm not saying that we don't have a property tax system that is riddled with inequity, but I don't think that this is the answer. I think that we need to go back to the basics. The league has a long-standing position of wanting fair and equitable property taxes, and I think that I would throw in there understandable. And so I think that this is an amendment that was brought forward by a special interest group, and I think that in order to have true property tax reform, and I'm using air quotes there, you have to bring everyone to the table and determine what's good about our system and what's not so good about our system, and how do we come up with a system that is more fair, more equitable, and more understandable. Specific proposals, call me. I'll bend your ear on those all day long. So,
Amber, I just want to maybe add a little bit to that in terms of saying that what you referenced and everything you said is 100% correct. But this is Scott Dudley. Sorry, I wanted to make sure that we're looking at comprehensive. We want to look at comprehensive tax reform in general, not just property, not just as it relates to property tax. What you said certainly is part of the equation, and that we want a fair and equitable property tax system, but looking generally at the tax system that we rely on in the state of Florida so that it's less reliant on the boom that always leads to bust. And so that's more just, I guess, a higher view in terms of what the league's position is with respect to the tax system.
Great. Okay, the next question. It is unlikely this amendment will be defeated given the history of Florida voters on property tax reform. What legislative strategies is the league planning for the future to compensate for these amendments and to safeguard local revenue streams? And I think JT is going to weigh in on this.
Yes, this is John Thomas. My hope is that the voters on November the 6th will see it differently. Florida has had a history of supporting these sort of initiatives. But Amendment 1, on Amendment 1 in 2008, there were a number of counties that defeated Amendment 1. So we're hopeful that a majority of the citizens will do the same thing. In this case, as Scott and Amber's referenced, the league really looks forward to some sort of comprehensive approach to taxes in Florida, something that's fair and equitable, and something that's going to benefit all citizens, and more importantly, that people can understand. In this particular amendment, it's just very difficult and convoluted, such that folks won't really understand what they're voting on.
And John, if I could, this is Scott again, Scott Dudley. John said that a majority of the voters. Fortunately, we don't actually need a majority of the voters. We need 41%, 40 plus 1% in order to defeat it. So, because with the Constitution the way it is in terms of amending it, you need 60% for something to pass. And so, a simple 40% plus will get us there. And I think that by workshops like this, webinars like this, and other ways in terms of each city taking some action by adopting a resolution, talking to your civic clubs around your area, basically being engaged in this, I think we can get to that 40% plus 1.
And one other thing, this is Amber again, that I'd like to add. I think the second part of that question was legislative action, or to kind of stop constitutional limits. I say that's why advocacy is so important. I think that it's, all 11 constitutional amendments and the 5 property tax ones that are on the ballot are all coming out of the legislature. These are not citizen-initiated constitutional amendments. So I think that as you build those relationships with your legislators, that it's important for them to understand how important of a revenue source property taxes are. I think that's a good, something that they need to understand, that they've gone down 20%, but if they continue to add patchwork amendments to this property tax system, they'll just continue to go down, and they are so vital. They are one of the most important vital sources of general revenue. So go start the relationships and advocate for your cities.
Okay, the next question is regarding the non-homestead assessment limitation that sunsets January 1, 2019. What is that limitation?
Current law is the assessment limitation is 10%, so that an assessment assessed value cannot grow more than 10% every year. That is the one that sunsets in 2019. If Amendment 4 is to pass, that new assessment limitation will be 5%, and the sunset date will be 2023. So it pushes back the sunset date of what is current law.
Okay. How much does Amendment 4 reduce taxes as a percentage of total tax revenues? How can we estimate the reduction for us in each city?
Well, I mean, if you want to look at total tax, hold on, let me find my piece of paper. You mean total tax revenues or property tax revenues, Jenna?
The question stated total tax revenues.
Whoever asked that question, could you send me an email, and when I get back into the office, I will send you total. I can do cities, total tax collection for all cities, and then break out the percentages of this amendment. So if you can send me an email, that would be great.
Okay, the next says, from the chart titled Estimated Taxable Value Impacts, it appears that just valuations are projected to decrease all the way through 2017. Aren't property values beginning to tick upwards now?
It depends on where you are. I know that as I've traveled around the state and talked to many finance officers, some people are seeing even or a couple ticks up. Some people are still seeing depressed. So you have to understand that these are statewide numbers. And while I think that this year they redid the estimates and it went up, but it's not even 0.5% that it went up. I think it was like 0.3%, but that is a statewide number.
Okay, great. We don't have any additional questions at this time. I'll give a few more minutes in case anybody's still typing in. Let me go back to the contact information slide in case you'd like to contact any of us directly with any of your questions. A new question that came in says, will you be in the Lake Worth area soon?
Is that directed at me?
Well, I mean, we travel. If there's a need for us to go to the Lake Worth area, we're certainly happy to. If you have an event that we need to go to, or a forum for us to speak at, we'll certainly put it on our calendars and make that happen. But yeah, so you'll email Scott Dudley at sdudley@flcities.com. I'm happy to try to plug somebody into if you have an event near Lake Worth. Happy to do it.
Okay, great. Well, they just followed up to that question and said we will contact your office. So we're looking forward to setting that up with you. Can you tell me the impact of A4 on Cape Coral residents? Oh, of Amendment 4 on Cape Coral residents. I think that'll be. Sorry, go ahead, Amber.
No, go ahead, Jenna.
Okay, I was just going to say that'll probably be the same procedure as the other city that asked. If you have questions specifically about your city and those impacts, email Amber Hughes, and she'll give you any information she can considering your municipality. Okay, great. Thank you all so much for joining us today. That concludes our webinar. The League of Cities would like to thank you for your participation, and we hope to hear from you soon. Thanks again.